In the small university town of Moscow, Idaho, a massacre of 4 college students in the middle of the night so horrific, the coroner is still processing what she saw.
Columbia, one of the favorites going in, was eliminated in the first round. The team returned home on Wednesday to anonymous threats that were carried out.
It's November 12th, 2022. Madison Mogan and her best friend, Kaylee Goncalves, were at the Corner Club bar in Moscow, Idaho. The two were having a great Saturday night, and that would go the same for the other 2 roommates that were out that night, Ethan Chapin and his girlfriend, Sana Kernodle, who were both 20. Chapin was attending a formal with his sister, and after would go spend time with Kernodle. At around 1:45 a.m. on November 13th, all 6 of the roommates returned to the house that they shared. There were 2 more roommates named Dylan Mortison and Bethany Funk, who survived the murders. Also, Chapin did not live at the home, but was staying over that night with Kernodle. A couple hours later, the quiet street was interrupted with a car driving up to the home. Inside was a DoorDash driver dropping off an order Kernodle had placed at around 4 a.m. This next encounter is a testimony Bethany made. Shortly after the DoorDash order arrived at the home, Bethany heard what she thought to be Goncalves playing with her dog. They also heard Kernodle crying in a male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Shortly after, Bethany looked out her bedroom door and saw an individual wearing all black clothing walk past her room. She knew she did not recognize the individual and stood there in shock. She later described the individual as a male around 5'10", fit, and having bushy eyebrows. Only 17 minutes after the delivery arrived, a security camera picked up noises that sounded like a dog barking and whimpering. The next morning on November 13th, the 2 surviving roommates called their friends over to check on the 4 roommates upstairs. They told their friends they believed they passed out and weren't waking up. At 11:58 a.m., police received a call from one of the roommates telling them the same thing they told their friends. However, once police arrived and went upstairs, they would come to the discovery of the 4 victims stabbed to death. After investigating the crime scene, a knife sheath was found that belonged to the killer, and after testing it, the killer's DNA was found on it. Eventually, police would inspect the surveillance video from the night before. A video was found at around 1:30 a.m., and it shows Madison and Kaylee ordering from a food truck. However, right behind them is a male, and with enhanced audio, you can hear Madison say, "Fuck you, mister." After they received their food and left, the man followed them. However, police would eventually clear this man as innocent. The other surveillance video they looked at was right outside the house, where you can see a white Honda Elantra drive by the house 4 times. They eventually traced this car back to Pullman, Washington, which is only a 20-minute drive. On November 29th, a Washington State University officer came forward and said a white Honda Elantra was registered at that university. Around 1 month later, after the murders on December 15th, a man driving that same car was pulled over twice by Indiana State Police. The identity of this man is Brian Koberger, and traveling with him in the passenger seat is his father. The first time he was pulled over was for speeding, and the second time was for following a vehicle too close. Body camera footage shows the first time he was pulled over.
Hello?
How you doing?
How y'all doing today? Good, good. Take a look at your driver's license real quick if I could. See, he's right up on that van, man. He was right up on the back end of that van. Pulled you over for tailgating.
Shortly after pulling them over, the officer lets the 2 go and doesn't think anything of it. However, to investigators, Brian was very suspicious, and on December 27th, police went into Koberger's trash can and dug out a piece of trash that had Brian's DNA on it and took it in for testing. After further testing, it was determined that the DNA placed on the piece of trash matched the DNA on the knife sheath, and only 3 days later, Brian was arrested for the murders of the 4 college students. To this day, the case is still ongoing. In May, Brian pleaded not guilty, and his trial is expected to begin in June 2025 in Boise, Idaho. Andrés Escobar was born on March 13, 1967. Escobar had a nice home life growing up in Medellin, Colombia. Even from a young age, locals recognized him as a talented soccer player. By the time he was only 17 years old, he had already signed his first professional contract with club Atlético Nacional, which are based in Colombia. It took Escobar a while to fit in with the squad, but eventually after one of Atlético's players got his contract terminated, Escobar was able to fill in his role. His luck would skyrocket even further when the club's coach, Maturana, who was also coaching the Colombia national team, called Escobar to join them. In Escobar's first ever game with the national team, they thrashed Canada 3-0, and Escobar's stay with the national team seemed to be permanent. The decision to keep Escobar was deemed to be a great decision, as he helped them win the Copa Libertadores and led them to multiple victories. On February 24, 1990, Escobar left Atletico to join club Young Boys in Switzerland. However, Escobar would only stay in Switzerland for 6 months, failing to adapt with his new club. He would return to Atletico, where he remained for the rest of his career, helping the club win even more trophies. However, in 1993, he suffered a knee injury, missing the Copa America tournament, where Colombia finished third, and the campaign to qualify for the 1994 World Cup that was being held in the United States. Luckily, by the time he fully recovered in early 1994, he was reunited with the squad, where they went on a 7-game winning streak before the World Cup began. However, Escobar's amazing career would take a sudden turn with just one mistake on June 22nd, 1994. The match was against the United States, and Colombia seemed the strong side, getting multiple opportunities. That was until the 33rd minute. The game finished 2-1, and shortly after, despite being Switzerland 2-0, they were eliminated from the World Cup. After the World Cup, Escobar couldn't sleep and wanted to be left alone. However, to people around him, he also seemed optimistic and wanted to look ahead to the future. Eventually, Escobar returned to his hometown of Medellin. On July 2nd, Escobar and his friends walked into a club. After sitting down, 2 men named Pedro and Santiago Galan began taunting Escobar by chanting, "Own goal, Andreas, own goal." Escobar politely asked the 2 men to stop, but they ignored him, so he walked away. Despite moving to a different area of the bar, Escobar wasn't comfortable for the rest of the night and eventually decided to leave. As he was walking to the parking lot, he had his head down, and once he looked up, he realized there were 3 men just glaring at him. He also came to the conclusion these were the same men harassing him in the club, and once again, they began to taunt him out in the parking lot. Escobar told them it was a mistake, but despite pleading with them to stop, one of the men took out a gun and shot Escobar 6 times. Each time a shot rang out, the shooter said, "Goal." All 3 men quickly made their escape, and Escobar laid out in the parking lot, bleeding to death. Luckily, only 1 day later, Escobar's killer would be caught. A man named Humberto Castro Munoz admitted to killing Escobar. Munoz was sentenced to 43 years in prison, but only after 10 years of serving his sentence, he was released on good behavior. Santiago Escobar, Andres' brother, who is a former soccer player as well, said this about his brother: "We lived our childhood together. Our football careers were very similar. I loved him, and I still do."
Look, fellas, it's Rudolph.
The civilians of London look out their windows and see a never-ending void of fog. It's 1952. Smoke is galloping through the air of London. Unfortunately, the city had a history of this much fog and pollution. As early as the 13th century, pollution would glide through the air, and many complaints were made. Nothing was changed, unfortunately, and by the 1700s, it had gotten worse due to factories opening that burned coal. The smoke would also produce dark clouds because water vapor would attach itself to microscopic particles called particulates that were released from the coal. Locals would give these clouds the name smog, a merge between smoke and fog. By the 19th century, people would die from the pollution and fog that lingered in the air, and no efforts were made to prevent further facilities. Luckily, during the 20th century, many factories finally relocated to the outside of London, and the amount of fog would reduce. But on December 5th, 1952, that would quickly change. On that day, a storm called an anticyclone would form over the city. The definition of an anticyclone reads as a weather system with high atmospheric pressure at its center, around which air slowly circulates in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction. Anticyclones are associated with calm, fine weather. On that day when the anticyclone occurred, it caused cold air to be trapped below warm air. Due to this, the pollution that was being released in the air also got trapped and couldn't escape towards the sky, so instead, it produced an enormous cloud of fog. As the giant cloud seeped into the streets of London, visibility would become almost non-existent. If you stood in the cloud, you couldn't see your own feet. Even plays that were being conducted in theaters had to be shut down because you couldn't see the stage. Unfortunately, during the 5 days this fog lingered over London, it was estimated that about 4,000 people died from pneumonia and bronchitis. However, even after the fog cleared up, people were still affected, and in total, there's an estimate of 12,000 people who lost their lives. It wouldn't be until 1956 that the British government established the Clean Air Act. The act required that smoke-free areas should be placed around the city, and it also restricted coal being burnt. Civilians were also offered grants that would allow them to begin using better heating sources, such as natural gas and electricity. It's May 28th, 1980, and an employee meeting is being conducted inside a swinger's psych shop and Custom John's head shop. While the meeting was going on, one of the employees, Dorothy Scott, noticed one of her coworkers, Conrad Bostrom, had a red mark on his arm and overall did not look well. Dorothy eventually decided that Conrad had to go to the hospital, so she and one of her other coworkers named Pam Head drove him to the UC Urban Medical Center in Orange, California. While driving to the hospital, Dorothy decided to stop at her parents' house to check on her 4-year-old son, Sean, and to change her red scarf out for a black one. After arriving at the hospital and being brought to a room, it was determined that the red mark on Conrad's arm was a black widow spider bite, and he was given treatment. He remained at the hospital until he was finally released at 11 p.m. For the entire time he was at the hospital, both Dorothy and Pam remained in the waiting room. After his release, Dorothy offered to pull her car around so Conrad didn't have to walk far, and he accepted. Before going to the parking lot, Dorothy used the bathroom. While she was doing that, Pam and Conrad were filling out paperwork, and once they were done, they sat and waited for a few minutes, but the car was nowhere to be seen. The pair eventually went out to the parking lot, and they eventually saw Dorothy's car speeding towards them. They started waving their arms to let her know they were there, but the car drove right past them. The two were obviously confused, but came to the conclusion that Dorothy had some sort of emergency, maybe with her son. However, after not hearing from her for hours, they decided to call the police and report her missing. Almost 10 miles away from the hospital, a car is found set on fire. It was determined to be a 1973 Toyota station wagon, and it belonged to Dorothy. Investigators would quickly go visit her parents Vera and Jacob and question them about anything that could help them find her. Her parents said that months before her disappearance, Dorothy would start receiving calls at her secretary job from a man who would either tell her he loved her or threatened to kill her. He also admitted to stalking her by telling her what she did that day. Dorothy told her parents that she remembered the man's voice, but didn't remember his name. The man not only threatened her at work, but at her own home. One day in particular, the man would call Dorothy's home phone and tell her to go outside because he had something for her. She complied, and what she found was a dead red rose sitting on her windshield. Before her disappearance, she was preparing to defend herself by taking karate lessons and was considering buying a handgun just in case this man attacked her. On June 12th, a managing editor named Pat Riley received a call from a man who admitted to killing Dorothy by saying,
"I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She also denied having someone else. I killed her."
The man would go into details about the case that were not released to the public, such as Conrad getting a spider bite on May 28th and Dorothy changing her scarf. He also said that Dorothy called him that night, but Pam said that Dorothy was with her the entire night at the hospital. Over a week later after her disappearance, Dorothy's parents received a phone call. Once they answered, they heard a man say,
"Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" "Well, I've got her."
The same man would call the house every Wednesday for 4 years until April 1984 when Jacob answered the phone for the first time instead of Vera, and the man suddenly stopped calling. A couple months later, a construction worker was by the Santa Ana Canyon Road when he found a set of canine and human bones and alerted authorities. The bones seemed partially burned, and it was estimated they were there for about 2 years. The reason for the bones being burnt turned out to be a bushfire that had occurred in that area in 1982. Bones were not the only thing that was found. A watch and a turquoise ring were also found as well. Vera would have a look at the two items and she confirmed that they were her daughter's. The watch had stopped at 12:30 a.m. Her death was confirmed when the bones came back as a match to Dorothy's. Due to the only remains of Dorothy being bones, it was impossible to determine a cause of death. What made this even worse was after the bones were found, the same man started calling Dorothy's parents again. They tried to trace the number, but due to the short amount of time the man was on the phone, they couldn't trace it. Unfortunately, as years went by, leads for this case would become cold, and that's where it sits to this day. Tommy Lynn Sells was born on June 28, 1964 in Oakland, California. Tommy grew up in a big family with 6 other siblings and his mother. When he was only 18 months old, he and his twin sister, Tammy, contracted spinal meningitis. Unfortunately, Tammy would pass away from the virus, but Tommy would end up surviving. When he was only 7 to 8 years old, Tommy was already drinking alcohol that he stole from his grandfather, and according to Tommy, was in a relationship with a man who had molested him. His mother knew everything about it and supported it. At the age of 10, Tommy was addicted to smoking marijuana. One night, when he was 13, Tommy would crawl into his grandma's bed while she was sleeping. He was also nude while he did this. He was obviously caught, and his entire family left his ass home alone. And I'm not joking, his entire family left their home, leaving Tommy behind. Soon after figuring out his family just abandoned him, Tommy decided he was going to hit the road and cross the United States. However, over this journey, Tommy would commit multiple murders. The victims I'm about to talk about are only the ones that are confirmed to be linked to Tommy. In July 1985, while working at a carnival, which was one of the multiple jobs Tommy worked at while he was traveling, he met a single mother named Anna Cord and her son Rory, who was 4 years old. The two started talking and flirting, and eventually Anna invited Tommy to her house for a hookup. The next morning, Tommy woke up and caught Anna trying to steal something from his backpack. In response, Tommy grabbed Rory's baseball bat and beat Anna to death. He did the same to Rory soon after. Tommy would flee town after that, and the bodies of a mother and her child wouldn't be found until 3 days later. The next victim was Suzanne Corks. Suzanne was last seen at a bar in Rockport, New York, and after storming out of the bar after a fight with her boyfriend, Tommy attacked and killed her. Her remains wouldn't be found for 8 years. Just a few months later, in October of 1987, 21-year-old Stephanie Stroh was hitchhiking in Nevada. Tommy was driving that night, and when he saw Stephanie on the side of the road, he knew he was going to kill her. Once he picked her up, he would strangle her to death and throw her body into a hot spring where her remains would never be recovered. A month after that, Tommy would become friends with Russell Keith Dardine, and soon after befriending him, Russell decided to invite Tommy to his home in Enna, Illinois. Once Tommy arrived, he met Russell's wife, Ruby, who was 7 months pregnant, and the couple's 3-year-old son, Peter. While they were talking, Tommy decided to confess his horrific murders to Russell, and after telling him this, he attacked and killed Russell. He would then turn to Ruby, and he would rape and start beating her. During the beating, Ruby ended up going into labor and giving birth to her daughter. Once Ruby was murdered, Tommy beat the newborn and beat her to death. Around 5 years later, Tommy was waiting under an overpass with a sign that said, "I will work for food." As he was standing, a 19-year-old college student named Fabine Witherspoon walked up to him. She started talking to him, and shortly after, she invited him to her home so he could get some food. However, once the pair got into her house, Tommy grabbed a knife and attacked her. Fabine fought back though, and managed to grab the knife he was holding and started stabbing him. Eventually though, Tommy grabbed a piano stool and hit her over the head with it, knocking her unconscious. The next time she woke up was in a hospital bed, suffering from a head injury and a hand laceration. Luckily, Tommy was also in the hospital from his injuries, and police were interrogating him. He was eventually taken to court, but was only given a 5-year sentence for malicious wounding. After finishing his sentence, Tommy would go right back to killing. He would first break into 10-year-old Joe Kirkpatrick's room while he was sleeping and attacked him with a knife. His mother, Julie, would wake up hearing the struggle occurring in her son's room and bolted. When she got inside, she saw a man with a ski mask stabbing her son, and she began beating him. The man eventually ran away, but unfortunately, it was too late and Joel would lose his life. After arriving, police would interrogate Julie about the events that occurred. However, police didn't believe her because at the time they found no evidence of the events she was describing occurring, and by the year 2000, Julie was taken to court and charged with first-degree murder for the death of her son and sentenced to 65 years in prison. It wouldn't be until 2 years later when Tommy confessed to the murder and Julie would be found not guilty. On April 18th, 1999, 2 years after the murder of Joel, Tommy would kidnap 9-year-old Mary Perez from a festival in San Antonio, Texas. Only a week later, her body was found in a creek and her cause of death was strangulation. Just months later, Tommy would be attending a church in Del Rico, Texas when he met the Harris family. He once again befriended them and gained their trust, but on December 31st, 1999, that would change. Tommy found out that Mr. Harris would be out of town that night and decided he was going to go after 13-year-old Kayleen. That night, Tommy would break into the family's trailer home, come into Kayleen's room, and stab her 16 times. After the murder, Tommy noticed that Kayleen's friend, Crystal Searles, who was 10 at the time, was sleeping on the top bunk. Tommy would quickly slash her throat and leave. Little did Tommy know, Crystal ended up surviving the attack and acted dead until Tommy left. After, she ran a quarter of a mile to one of the neighbors' houses to get help. Because her throat was slashed, she had to communicate to the neighbors using paper. She was eventually taken to the San Antonio hospital where she made a full recovery. Police would come and question her about the events, and with the sketch that her and police made, Tommy Lynn Sells was arrested. By the end of his trial, he was given the death penalty for the murder of Kayleen Harris and a life sentence for the murder of Mary Perez. During questioning, he admitted to multiple other murders that I talked about, but he could be responsible for around 70. 14 years after his court case concluded, on April 3rd, 2014, Tommy was finally given lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary.
Well, for once, this is a true fish story. Down under in Australia, they use fish this size for bait. That's right, bait to catch man-eating sharks.
On April 17th, 1935, a fisherman was on his boat on Coogee Beach in Australia when he went to catch a small shark. As he was rowing in his catch, an over 13-foot-long shark swam and ate the small shark. Due to the larger shark eating the smaller shark, it also got caught, and the fisherman was able to reel in this massive monster to land. The shark would be taken to Coogee Aquarium Baths, where they used it as an attraction for locals to enjoy. This was a huge attraction due to the fact that at the time in Sydney, specifically at New South Wales beaches, 3 men had been murdered by sharks between February and March of that year. Days after the shark's capture, it seemed in good health. However, on April 25th, it was a different story. While locals and travelers were observing the shark, it would choke up a human arm. It was quickly taken in for investigation. At first, it was thought that the shark had attacked a human, but it was soon figured out that the arm had been removed from somebody's body and fed to the shark, which means this was classified as a homicide. It was theorized that the arm was in the shark's stomach for 8 to 18 days. Due to the short amount of time that the arm was in the shark's stomach, it was actually really well preserved. Fingerprints were still recoverable, and the tattoo of 2 boxers fighting was still visible. Using the fingerprints, police identified the arm belonging to Jim Smith. Jim was bankrupt, but made some money by being a bookmaker, which is someone who charges a fee on each bet they make in sports. He also did boxing and had a small criminal record of some illegal gambling. Police would eventually come in and start their investigation about who murdered Jim Smith. Luckily, it wouldn't take long to get their first lead, because the last time Jim had been seen was with one of his friends, Patrick Brady, drinking at a bar in the Cecil Hotel. Patrick is already known to police due to him forging multiple documents. What made this lead even more interesting was the day after Jim was last seen, a cab driver picked up Patrick and he asked if he could be taken to a businessman's home named Regina Lloyd Holmes in North Sydney. Holmes ran a boat building business that was successful, but he also ran a smuggling ring for speedboats that picked up cigarettes and cocaine. It would turn out that Jim used to work for Holmes and pick up what he wanted. However, their friendship would be severed after an insurance scam they were running failed. After this, Jim began blackmailing Holmes, threatening to leak his illegal crimes to the world. At this point in the case, police had a bunch of evidence connecting the two to the crime. The only thing they were looking for now was a confession from both of them. They took the pair in for questioning, but Holmes said he had never met Patrick before and denied being connected to the crime. On May 20th, the case would take a massive turn. That day, Holmes got into one of his speedboats, drove out into the harbor, and pulled out a gun he brought with him and tried to commit suicide. After the shot, he fell into the ocean, but a rope got caught around his wrist, which prevented him from drowning. Realizing what just happened, Holmes quickly climbed back onto his boat and tried to flee because police were already alerted about what was happening and started chasing him. For 4 hours, police were trying to capture him until finally Holmes gave up and surrendered. Holmes eventually agreed to testify against Patrick, but on June 12th, just days before the trial for Jim's murder, Holmes committed suicide, and this time he was successful. Due to this, the case against Patrick completely fell apart, even though the cab driver gave his testimony against him. He stated that when Patrick got into the car, he looked disheveled, kept one of his hands in his pocket for the entire car ride, and was paranoid about being followed by someone. The trial concluded in less than 2 days, and Patrick was found not guilty, and this case seemed like it would go quiet forever. Luckily though, that statement would be false. More information would be discovered, and it turned out that Jim used to be a police informer, which is someone who tattletales if someone has done something illegal. Jim would report to police about a man named Eddie Wayman, and because of the information Jim gave to the police, Eddie was caught robbing a bank. Once again though, this lead would fizzle out, but it was theorized that in some sort of revenge scheme, Eddie could have killed Jim. To this day, this case remains unsolved. It's 1931. A 70-foot yacht takes off from Los Angeles, California for the very first time. 4 years after, the owner of the sailboat, a famous director named Roland West, would sail the west coast with his boat, which he named Joyita. He named it this because Joyita translates to Little Jewel in Spanish, and his wife's name was Jewel. In 1936, Jewel would file for divorce, which left Roland in debt. While the actual reason hasn't been confirmed, it has been a theory to help him get out of debt he sold Joyita. Once World War II started, Joyita would be turned into a patrol boat and monitored the seas around Hawaii. During the war, work would be done on the boat and some of the parts in it would be replaced with lower quality materials. This would be an issue because the boat was mostly made out of wood and a material called cork was used to weigh the ship down. However, with the replacement of some of the internal parts, it made the ship a lot lighter than the water it sailed on. After the war ended, the boat would be used to transport materials and would be used for fishing. On October 3rd, 1955, the boat would set sail from Apia, which is the capital of the country, Samoa, and make its way towards Tokelau, which is around a 270-mile trip, and it would only take 48 hours to complete. Before the boat took off, it was known that only one of the engines on the boat was working due to some of the equipment failing. However, it was decided that the trip would still go on because of the short distance. So on that very day, 25 people would board the boat, 9 passengers and 16 crew members. Also on the boat were some construction materials and medical supplies. And as the boat drifted into the infinite abyss of the ocean, the last thought that crossed the passengers' minds would be this would be the last time they would see land again. New Zealand Air Force hover over the sea. At this point, the ship had not been seen for 3 days. and a report was finally made 24 hours after the expected arrival date. Unfortunately, after looking, there was no evidence of the boat ever being at sea. However, that would all change over a month later on November 10th. Around 600 miles away, where the search for the Joyita was being conducted, a boat was found floating in the sea. The boat was found by the crew on the merchant ship called the Tuvalu. Some of the members were calling out to see if anyone was on the boat, but there were no replies, so they eventually decided to make their way over to the boat to investigate further. All 25 passengers were nowhere to be seen, but the strange thing was that the boat itself was perfectly fine and showed no signs of sinking. However, on the boat, broken glass was scattered everywhere, along with multiple bandages covered with blood. A medical bag was also lying on the deck. Even stranger, one of the boat's working engines was found covered in mattresses, and there was still plenty of fuel in it. The other engine that wasn't working was also found, and it looked to be messed up with an attempt to fix it. The ship seemed to have crashed at 10:25 p.m. because all of the clocks on the ship had stopped at that time. It was also found that the communication radio had been changed to 2182 kilohertz, which is known as a distress frequency. However, it turned out that the radio had not been working, which the staff on the boat might not have known. It would quickly be figured out that the reason this crash happened was because a pipe that had been replaced during World War II had been leaking, which caused water to start invading. Unfortunately, while at sea, crew members wouldn't have been able to do anything to stop the leak. However, despite the leak, a conclusion is made that all 25 members on board would have had a better chance at survival than the lifeboats that were taken, and the captain driving the boat that night would have known this, so the question to authorities was, why did the captain not tell the other passengers to stay on the boat? Unfortunately, it seems none of the 25 passengers survived, and this tragic incident could have easily been prevented before the ship set sail.
Great adventure runs on magic at night. Magic and music and light. Brilliant laser shows, fireworks that glow.
It's May 11th, 1984. An amusement park is flooded with people playing different games, going on rides, and touring the attractions. One attraction in particular was busy that night, and it was a haunted castle that was located at Six Flags Great Adventure in Jacksonville Township, New Jersey. In line that night was a 13-year-old boy, and he eventually started talking to another boy who was 14 years old. The 13-year-old told him that he was nervous about going in, so the 14-year-old offered to go in with him. So, once it was their turn to go through, them and the other people in their group started walking in. As the two boys were walking, the 14-year-old boy took out a lighter to use so the other boy could see. However, while he was walking, the boy with the lighter bumped into the wall, causing it to catch on fire. The boy immediately started patting the wall down, but nothing was working, so he and the boy ran out screaming, "Fire!" After running out, an employee went inside to investigate because teenagers would usually pull pranks, but he quickly discovered they were telling the truth. One of the actors inside the building began helping people out the main exit, and it seemed everyone made it out okay. Once the fire department arrived, they were luckily able to extinguish the flames at around 7:45 p.m. 15 minutes after this, the park officially shut down. After the fire was put out, firefighters walked through the castle's remains and would make a shocking discovery. 8 teenagers who attempted to escape the attraction perished in the fire. All 8 of them had their faces against the air conditioning grates trying to get oxygen before the fire took their lives. After investigating further, it turned out the castle had almost no safety precautions. The exit signs didn't work, the fire alarms were vandalized, and some of the emergency exit doors had been boarded off. Because of this evidence, both companies, Great Adventure and Six Flags, were charged with aggravated manslaughter. Park management were also found guilty and charged with manslaughter for ignoring safety warnings. During the trial, 5 fire prevention consultants claimed they warned the park about installing sprinklers and smoke alarms, but the park never listened. It was also revealed that many people that visited the castle used lighters, so the 14-year-old who used his lighter wasn't the first. 2 months later, the jury came to the conclusion that Great Adventure and Six Flags were not guilty, and instead, the cause of this fire was shifted towards Jackson Township for allowing the park to bypass the fire codes. Because of this tragic event, a new law called the Special Provisions for Special Amusement Buildings was signed. It states that all amusement builds must include a sprinkler system. If the attraction is in the dark, a smoke detector is required as well. It's May 23rd, 1918. The moon has been sitting in the night sky for hours. A couple, Joseph and Catherine Maggio, are sleeping in their apartment above the Maggio grocery store. As the night continues on, a figure makes his way into the couple's bedroom. In his hand, he wields a razor and an axe. He slowly makes his way to the couple's bed, and while standing over them, he slits both of their throats. After committing what would be his first murder, he raised the axe over his head and struck. After police arrived at the couple's apartment, they found the killer's clothes soaked in blood. After looking around, no valuable items were taken, so the reason being robbery was eliminated. Eventually, police would go outside of the apartment, and they discovered a note that read,
Miss Joseph Maggio will sit up tonight. Just right, Miss Tony.
Unfortunately, as the weeks passed, no more evidence would be found, and it eventually went cold. Only a month later, on June 27th, police found a similar crime scene. Louis Bessumer, who was a grocer, and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, were found in their apartment at the back of the grocery store that Louis worked at. The couple were attacked with an axe, but this crime scene was different. Louis had been hit above the right temple, and Harriet was hit on the left ear. Luckily, it turned out the two were still alive and were immediately taken to the hospital. After being transported, it turned out one side of Harriet's face was partially paralyzed. A surgery was performed to fix it, but only 2 days after the surgery, she passed away. Before her passing though, she was able to talk to police, and she told them that she thought Louis was the one who attempted to kill her. Once Louis was released from the hospital, he was charged with Harriet's murder and served 9 months in prison. However, the jury eventually decided to set him free, and on May 1st, 1919, they would do so. Only a couple months later, on August 5th, 1918, Anna Schneider, who was pregnant at the time, was found by her husband clutching onto life. Her face had been bashed and her scalp had been cut open. Luckily, she was discovered just in time and taken to the hospital and made a full recovery. Only a couple days later, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. At this point, police were certain these attacks and murders were connected to one person. Just days later, on August 10th, Joseph Romano, who also worked as a grocer, was discovered by his two nieces that lived with him. The pair had heard commotion coming from his room, and as they walked in, they saw their uncle's attacker fleeing, and they saw their uncle bleeding from his head. Joseph was taken to the hospital, but only a couple days later, he died from serious head trauma. The nieces were interviewed about the man they saw and described him as a heavy-set man with dark skin, wearing a dark suit and a slouched hat. During this time, the civilians of New Orleans were in terror. They reportedly had seen a man walking around neighborhoods with an axe in his hand, and locals found axe chisels in their backyard. However, days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months without any sign of the axemen committing murders, and the terror people felt started dying down. Unfortunately though, on May 10th, 1919, the terror people felt back in August would be restored. Charles Cortamilia, who once again worked as a grocer and an immigrant, his wife Rosie, and the couple's 2-year-old daughter were found in critical condition by a neighbor named Orlando Giordano, who heard screams from the family's home. Once Orlando arrived, he found Rosie with a massive head wound, holding her daughter, who unfortunately didn't survive the attack. Charles was lying on the ground, but luckily both Rosie and him survived. Later, Rosie would give her account, and she stated that once she woke up, she found Charles fighting off a big man holding an axe. Once the man knocked Charles to the ground, he swung at her and her daughter. Fortunately, she was also able to give police the identity of who attacked her family. She claimed that Orlando and his 18-year-old son, Frank, had attacked them. This claim had a lot of evidence against it though. Orlando, who was 69 at the time, was not in the best of health to commit this attack. How the attacker got in was through the panel in the back door. Frank was too big to fit through this panel. However, police still arrested the two. Charles would also be interviewed and openly denied Rosie's claims, but still, the two were taken to trial, where Orlando was sentenced to life in prison and Frank was given the death penalty. Charles' relationship with his wife would fall through, and they eventually got divorced. About a year after the divorce, Rosie came forward and stated the two were innocent, and luckily Orlando and Frank were released from prison. On March 14th of that same year, the Times Picayune newspaper received a letter from the Axemen. This is what the letter said.
Hell, March 13, 1919. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether surrounding your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what your Lenians and your foolish police call the Axemen. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of ye whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it was better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need for such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the Angel of Death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, March 19, 1919, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear, by all the devils in the nether regions, that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee, I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact nor realm of fancy, the Axeman.
On March 19th, everyone in New Orleans was blaring jazz music in their homes, and just like the Axeman said, there were no homicides. Unfortunately though, that statement would be short-lived. 4 more attacks would occur from August to October of that year. Steve Boca, William Carson, and Sarah Luman luckily all survived the Axemen. However, one of the victims, named Mike Pepitone, would not survive. The murder of Mike was the last known murder to police that the Axemen committed, and to this day, this case remains unsolved. To end off this video, instead of a true crime case, I wanted to talk about some of the disturbing experiments that were conducted on humans during the Holocaust. To forewarn you, these experiments I'm about to discuss are disturbing. I've left timestamps for these experiments in the description, so if you think any of them will upset you, please click off. During World War II, a project known as Unit 731 existed. It consisted of many human experiments, and it is believed that 10,000 to 12,000 people died from these horrific tests. One of them was weapon testing. Victims would usually have weapons such as swords, knives, and bayonets tested on them. They also used flamethrowers with no protection and tested X-ray exposure on them, which resulted in radiation sickness that killed multiple people. A psychologist named Yoshimura Hisatu worked in Unit 731 and conducted an experiment where he would take people's limbs and put them in a bucket of ice water. He held them in the bucket until the person developed frostbite. Once he got his results, he would either stick the frozen limb into boiling water, set the limb on fire, or didn't do anything and hope the person would heal from it. Vivisection was a procedure where a surgeon would take a patient that was usually ill with the plague, cholera, or gangrene, and with no anesthesia would amputate their limbs to study the disease. The reason they did this while the person was alive was to avoid the effects of decomposition. People that were studied for gangrene would either have their limbs reattached to the other side of their body, crush or freeze the limb, or cut off circulation. After they got done using the person, they usually shot or used lethal injection to kill them.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.